Soviet intelligence managed to conduct a masterpiece operation during the Great Patriotic War. It is said that it was thanks to the coherence of actions of the country's leadership and intelligence officers that Japan did not attack the USSR, and all forces could be transferred to protect the western borders. One of the key figures is Iskak Abdulovich Akhmarov. The Soviet spy first served in Turkey, then moved to China. After that, a new agent was needed in America as another Soviet spy went missing there. First visit to the United States. Iskar Akhmarov had been in the United States for more than 4 years since 1935, getting there illegally by ship from China. His agent network included State Department employees, various diplomats and people from the U.S. Armed Forces. Akhmarov sent all available information to Moscow. There, his reports were carefully analyzed and assumed what actions Washington would take in the near future in the international arena. In the United States, the Soviet intelligence officer met Helen Lowry. The girl was a relative of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the country. She actively helped Akhmarov, found safe houses for agents and was a liaison. Returned to the homeland. In 1939, Iskar Akhmarov received an order from Moscow. He was ordered to immediately suspend his activities and return back to the Soviet Union. The scout wanted to stay in the United States, which he reported in a telegram. He also wrote that he had recruited Helen Lowry and would marry her. His superior Pavel Fitton later wrote, People's Commissar Lavrenti Beria was furious. He was not satisfied that the agents did not want to obey him unconditionally. His position was slightly softened by the fact that Lowry is the niece of the head of the Communist Party of the United States, Earl Browder, and Joseph Stalin liked him very much. So Akhmarov managed to stay in the United States for another year and continue his work there. In 1940 he had to return home with his wife. Lowry changed her documents, became Elena Akhmarova and received a Soviet passport. Beginning of preparations for Operation Snow. In 1940, the USSR realized that the threat of invasion in the east was hanging over the country. Pavel Fitton, then head of foreign intelligence, convened a regular meeting, to which Akhmarov, who had returned from the United States, was invited. The intelligence officer said that Japan's potential was clearly underestimated, their army should be taken seriously, and pointed out that relations between Tokyo and Washington were far from ideal. Iskar Akhmarov suggested that the US could become, if not an ally, then seriously help the USSR, as it did in 1921. During the Civil War, Japan occupied part of the Far East and even began to advance in Siberia. It is not known how the war would have ended if not for the action of Washington. Over the Ocean did not want to strengthen the empire, so they sent an official note of protest to Tokyo. Washington demanded that the Japanese immediately withdrew their troops from Russia. Pavlov then said, historical analogies in the modern world very rarely fail, but it is still necessary to try all the levers of pressure and harass Japan if suddenly Tokyo wants to attack the USSR. Harry Dexter White. Akhmarov got acquainted with the Deputy Minister of the U.S. Department of Finance in America. He noted that the latter was an ardent anti-fascist. He had a serious influence on the entire cabinet and the U.S. government. Akhmarov offered to infiltrate agents and meet with White. He had to be convinced that Japan was a serious danger to the U.S., and in Washington would begin to distract the Japanese and prevented them from gathering forces for the subsequent attack on the USSR, if it was planned. Operation Snow. It began in the fall of 1940. It was decided to send Vitaly Pavlov, who was in charge of intelligence activities in America, to the United States. Akhmarov was not sent back to the ocean. He had already shown, and White could suspect something. The conversation was then very fast, Pavlov writes in his book. In the office were only Akhmarov and NKVD Chief Fitton and Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria. The latter ordered that the operation be completely classified. Historians even argue, some say that even Stalin himself did not know about Snow. The operation itself was called so, because the surname of the necessary official Dexter White in Russian translation from English means white. Pavlov traveled to the United States to carry out what he had planned, and eventually Washington began to act as Moscow needed. A triumph of Soviet intelligence. White's acquaintance with Akhmarov was superficial. The American knew him as an expert on Asia under the name Bill. Pavlov called the official and said that he sent greetings from Bill and had important information for him. The meeting took place at a popular restaurant, Pavlov wrote later. He began by saying that he was also an anti-fascist and had similar views to White in order to get him comfortable with him. The scout then acted on Akhmarov's prepared plan, talking about the Chinese threat and the strength of Japan. After the meeting, the USSR began to hope that the plan would work. And it did work. During Roosevelt's meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Kono in 1941, there were many of the theses that Pavlov talked about in his meeting with White. After that, Japan concentrated on hitting the United States, and the Soviet Union was able to move most of its troops to the Western Front for the war in Europe. In 1991, a U.S. Senator published a document in his book that confirmed the success of the Soviet intelligence operation. Hamilton Fish wrote that it was White who passed the information to the White House and convinced Roosevelt to concentrate on fighting Japan.